Now, we've talked about Russia before, but we've talked about Russia in the context of it being the Kievan Ruse, okay? Up in Kiev and Moscow and Novgorod. Now, remember, the Kievan Rus was north to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Remember, Rome was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they had beef. Used to be one Roman Empire, but then they broke into two. That break was in 1054, and it was over religion, the Great Schism. The West remained Catholic with the Pope and icons. The East became Eastern Orthodox with no Pope, no icons. Instead, they had a patriarch. Okay, so that Great Schism occurred, which means that the Byzantine Empire had enemies to the west of them, and they had enemies to the east of them. They had enemies with the Catholics, and they also had enemies with the Muslims in the east. So they wanted the people north of them to be their friends. They wanted allies. And so they tried to make the Kievan Rus an ally of the Byzantine Empire. In order to accomplish this, they linked themselves with the Kievan Rus politically, economically, and through marriage and religion. Okay, so economically, politically, and religiously. How did they do this politically? They had the leader of the Kievan Rus marry the daughter of a Byzantine emperor. How did they do this religiously? They sent missionaries. Y'all may remember Cyril, the missionary who created the Cyrillic alphabet, which later became the Russian alphabet. And they established trade with the Kievan Rus. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire and the Kievan Rus were tight. The Kievan Rus are going to form the Russian Orthodox Church. Remember that they become Christian because of missionaries like Cyril, and Cyril is going to be spreading the Byzantines' Eastern Orthodox religion. Eventually, that's going to become a Russian version of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, Rome fell in 476. So Constantinople claimed that it was the new capital of the Roman Empire, but then Constantinople fell in 1453. This means that the Kievan Rus are the last ones standing. And so the Kievan Rus, or Russia, is going to claim that Roman heritage. They say that now Moscow, after 62, is going to be the new capital of the ancient Roman Empire. So they're continuing that heritage. First Rome, then Constantinople, then Moscow. So not only do they take their religion from the Byzantine, they also take their claim of being a part of the Roman Empire, the inheritors of the Roman Empire and Roman culture. And so in this vein, the leaders of Russia, after they overthrow the Mongols in 1462, are going to call themselves Caesars, or Tsar for short. Now, if you see Tsar spelled with a Z, that's fine. It's just a different spelling for the same word. But these czars are going to rule with the support of the church because they claim the divine right of kings. Now, we know that when a ruler claims divine right, they typically tend to rule in an absolute manner. So Russia is going to become an absolute monarchy where the czar holds 100% of the power and is constantly fighting with the nobles for that power. Does that make sense so far? So all of this is context. What happened before Russia overthrew the Mongols? Well, Constantinople fell, therefore there's no Byzantine Empire. There's no more trading partner for the Kievan Rus. So they form their own empire, claiming to be descendants of ancient Rome. And they have a lot of similarities with the Byzantine Empire due to being tied politically, economically, and religiously to the Byzantine Empire. So we're seeing a lot of European influences in Russia at this time, but Russia is smack dab in the middle of those two continents. It's a part of Eurasia. So it's in Europe and it's in Asia at the same time. So what are some influences from Asia? Well, the Mongols come and invade in the 13th century and take over the Kievan Ruse, establishing a tributary state under the Golden Horde. Y'all may remember Batu Khan. So the Mongols establish a tributary state where the Russians have to pay them tribute. Because of tight Mongol control, Russia is not going to experience a renaissance like the rest of Europe. Whereas the rest of Europe is going through a rebirth and entering into the age of exploration and getting all this new technology and new ideas, Russia was still under the control of the Mongols. Okay, so they're going to be behind their European counterparts. Also, the spread of gunpowder under the Mongols is going to make Russia a gunpowder empire. Okay, so those are some Asian influences there. What about European influences? Well, obviously the Byzantine Empire is going to be a huge factor in the cultural aspects of Russia. Also, most of Russia's capitals are going to be in Europe. Kiev and Moscow, St. Petersburg, eventually, when Peter the Great takes over. All of their capitals are going to be in Europe, not in Asia. And I'll type those capitals in the chat because some of them are difficult to spell. So that's a European influence. All of these capitals being in Europe means that Russia is going to come into contact with the Enlightenment. They missed the Renaissance, but they're back in time for the Enlightenment ideals to spread. Okay, so you have Asian influence from the Mongols and European influence, notably from their Viking descendants from Scandinavia, first starting the Kievan Rus before the Mongols came in and established a tributary state. So what's the physical boundary between Europe and Asia? How do we know where Europe begins and where Asia ends? Well, the Ural Mountains, which is one of your vocabulary words, is the geographic physical boundary between Europe and Asia. You'll note that Russia begins over here on the western half of the Ural Mountains, but eventually is going to spread past that boundary to control both parts of Europe and Asia. So geographically, the barrier is here, but Russia is going to supersede those boundaries. Now, being in the middle of Asia and Europe does have its benefits. What's a benefit that Russia can get from their geographic location in Eurasia? What's a positive that they get from being smack dab in the middle? Trade in both Europe and Asia. Good, especially through what land route? Good, the Silk Road. Remember that during the Pax Mongolica, trade on the Silk Road was popping. Okay, so they've revived the Silk Roads. Once the Mongols lose control, the Silk Road trade isn't going to be as great because everyone moves to maritime routes instead with the age of exploration. But still, Russia's going to benefit from its geographic location in terms of trade. They're in an excellent spot for trade, especially with access to the Silk Road. One of their main exports is going to be the fur trade, which makes sense. Russia is super cold. So they're going to be exporting fur to Europe and to China. But they're also going to export a lot of other raw materials like grain, leather, iron, hemp, wood, pitch, tar, caviar, which is fancy people eggs, and honey. With the exception of leather and iron, all of these goods that they export, and export means to sell, all of these goods that they export are raw materials, okay? Wood and pitch and tar, those are going to be used to make ships because pitch and tar makes the ships waterproof. Okay, caviar is just fish eggs. Honey you get from honeycomb. Grain you get from the fields. Obviously, leather you have to treat from animal hides, and iron you have to melt down iron ore to make it. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of industrialization in Russia. Instead, you see exporting of raw goods. And that's because Russia is naturally resource rich. They have a lot of natural resources that they can sell for their benefit, kind of like the New World. Except, did the New World colonies get to benefit from the selling of their raw materials? No, they did not. Remember, under mercantilism in the New World, all of the New World's wealth went back to the mother country to benefit the mother country. But Russia isn't a colony. Okay, they're no longer a tributary state once they overthrow the Mongols. And so they are going to be able to sell their own resources for their own benefit. Are we good so far? All righty. So how do we go from the Kievan Ruse to Russia? Okay, so they went from the city of Moscow and the territory of Moscow to an entire empire. Well, we know that they're on the fringe of Europe, somewhere between Europe and Asia. And so they have influence from both sides. They have their influence of Viking descent from Scandinavia. The Vikings were a very militaristic seafaring people that led raids on towns and squares. So that's going to play into the militaristic personality of Russia. Also, the Mongols were very militaristic. And it's because of the Mongol influence in particular that the Russians are going to become a gunpowder empire. Now, we've talked about other gunpowder empires, most notably the Muslim gunpowder empires, the Mughal dynasty in India, the Safavid in Iraq and Iran, and the Ottoman in the former Byzantine Empire. Okay, those are the Muslim gunpowder empires because they're Muslim. Russia is a Christian gunpowder empire, a land-based empire that uses gunpowder technology in order to rise up and expand. Okay. Also from Europe, they have influence from the Byzantine Church, where they adapt Eastern Orthodoxy into Russian Orthodoxy. But the Mongols come in and take over in the 1200s, and they're going to rule there until 1462. Because of that control, Russia fails to go through a renaissance. They have to wait until they overthrow the Mongols in order to form their own empire. Once they do succeed in overthrowing the Mongols, we're going to see rapid expansion of Russia. Russia is going to become larger and larger under the czars. They're also going to use mercenary soldiers. Okay, a mercenary is a soldier who works for pay, and they're going to pull from the Cossacks. The Cossacks are basically Russian cowboys. These are serfs and peasants who escaped and are living in the wilderness, living off the land. And occasionally they'll fight for the government if the government pays them. Other times they try to overthrow the government because they don't like it so much. Okay, so it's kind of like a very tense relationship there. So if you look at the Mongol control under Genghis Khan, okay, remember that Genghis Khan formed the largest continuous land empire in history, starting in Karakoram. When he dies, his heirs, like Kublai Khan and Batu Khan, are going to expand his empire. Kublai Khan expands into China and establishes the Tang dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, okay? The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. Then the Golden Horde under Batu moves into Russia, conquers Kiev, Moscow, Novgorod, and they're going to establish tributary states. Now, why did the Russians and all of them pay tribute to the Mongols? Because the Mongols could beat them up. If you didn't pay the tribute to the Mongols, then they would kill you to death until you died. Now, that's a big threat when the Mongols are strong and in charge, but when they start to weaken after Genghis Khan's and his successors' deaths, y'all remember that the Mongols were very good conquerors, but they weren't great administrators. And so one of the Russian princes in Moscow is going to notice that, hey, the Mongols aren't as big and bad as they used to be. I think we can call their bluff. Next time they show up to collect their tribute, I'm going to send them packing. And so that's exactly what he did. Ivan III becomes the first Tsar of Russia, okay, who refused to pay tribute to the Mongols, to the Golden Horde. He calls their bluff. So here in this painting, he's depicted as telling them, I'm not going to pay your tribute. And then he kicks them out of his palace. Now, once he overthrows the Mongols in 1462, he's set up very nicely to become the king of Russia. But he has to legitimize his rule. He has to have religious legitimacy and political legitimacy. Well, he gets both of those when he marries the niece of the last surviving Byzantine emperor. Now, y'all may remember, by 1462, there is no Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople. But the emperor survived. He didn't rule anything, but he still has, some respect for his position. So by marrying Zoe, the niece of the last Byzantine Empire, okay, Ivan III builds up some political clout. In terms of religious clout, well, the Russians and the Byzantine Empire were both Christian, the same type of Christian. So he legitimizes his claim to rule religiously and politically through his marriage to the niece of the last Byzantine Empire. And this makes him the Tsar, the Caesar of Russia. Remember, there's no more Byzantine Empire. There's no more ancient Roman Empire. So Russia claims that they are the last descendants of of Roman heritage. Hence, Tsar Caesar as their king. Does that make sense so far? Now, Ivan III was known as Ivan the Great. So what did he do that was so great? Well, he's going to triple the size of Russia. He expands Russia past Muscovy to be much larger. He rebuilds the palace in Moscow, the Kremlin. But not everybody is going to be his biggest fan. This ties back to the constant continuity throughout this time period. The constant power struggle between the nobles and the king. Or in this case, the boyars and the czar. Boyar is one of your vocabulary terms. A boyar is a noble in Russia. That's all it means. And we know that there's a constant power struggle between the nobles and the king because they both want more power, so they try to take it from each other. So the boyars oppose Ivan III expanding Russia and getting all this power. So how does he respond? He takes their power. He takes their land, which remember is a form of wealth, and he forces them to live in the capital with him, just like Louis XIV of France did with his nobles at Versailles. He's going to force them to live in Moscow so he can keep an eye on his nobles. Now, the boyars and the czar aren't the only members of the Russian social hierarchy. This is a very static social hierarchy. Static meaning there's not a lot of changes. If you're born a peasant, you're going to die a peasant. If you're born a noble, you're going to die a noble. You're not going to go from being serf to merchant to czar. It's not going to happen. It's kind of like the caste system in India. There's not a lot of movement one way or another. So at the top of this hierarchy, you have the czar, the ruler, absolute control. Then you have the nobles, the people with land and money and influence who are vying for power with the Tsar. Then you have the middle class, the merchants, the artisans, lawyers, all of that. Then you have the farmers, the free farmers who own their own land. Okay, they're not rich, but they don't serve anybody else. And then finally at the bottom, you have the serfs. Okay, serfs are different from free peasants. Okay, because serfs are under a feudal obligation. Y'all remember that feudalism used to be a mutually beneficial contract. The noble lets you live on his land in exchange for you working his land. So he gets crops, you get a place to live and protection. But eventually that power dynamic is going to change to benefit the noble class over the peasant class. Okay, so serfs become owned labor. You can't sell and buy serfs, but they're tied to the plot of land that they've agreed to work on for that noble lord. And if someone else buys that land, then they have to work for whoever bought the land. So they're bound to the land and they have little personal freedom. They can't just go travel into town. They can't marry who they want. They have to get permission from the noble lord. Now, under the absolute rule of the czars, serfdom is going to get worse because the czar doesn't care about the serfs. They're not a threat to him. Yeah, they make up a majority of the population, but they don't have a lot of political influence or power. The nobles do. And the nobles like serfdom. So they're going to want to keep it. If the czar tries to get rid of serfdom, then the nobles will kill the czar. So in that power struggle, okay, the czars are not going to be that great to the serfs because the serfs don't give them anything that they need. Okay, so they're going to keep them in serfdom until after the Crimean War in the 1860s. Are we good so far? Here is Ivan the Great's wife, Zoe. Remember that they didn't get married for looks or for love. It was a political contract. So he married her because of what it could mean for him politically as the Tsar. His son, Vasily III, we don't really learn about in AP World History. So we're going to skip him and go to Vasily's son, who is Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV. Now it's important that you keep track of which Ivan you're talking about. Hence the Roman numerals. Ivan III is Ivan the Great. Ivan IV is Ivan the Terrible, which is a misinterpretation of the Russian. He's supposed to be Ivan the Terrifying, which he is, but also he did some terrible things, so it kind of sort of fits. Now, Ivan the Terrible is going to come to the throne when he's a toddler. His father, Vasily, dies when he's 3 years old. Obviously, he can't rule Russia as a 3-year-old. He's still wearing Pampers, right? So the boyars come in and try to wrest power from the Tsar, okay? And so there's the constant power conflict between the people who support the Tsar and the nobles. Well, eventually, Ivan IV gets old enough to crown himself as Tsar. So when he's 16, he crowns himself with absolute power, and he uses his secret police, the Oprichnina, to enforce that power, to search out for spies and to kill his enemies. Okay, the Oprichnina secret police, kind of the precursor to the Russian KGB. Now, what is he going to do as ruler? Well, like his grandfather, he is going to make Russia bigger. So he extends eastward, but also westward. Eastward, he's going to move into Mongol land controlled by the Golden Horde. Western, he is going to try to get to the Baltic Sea for a warm water port, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And for this expansion, he needs a lot of gunpowder. Okay, this is a gunpowder empire, an empire that expands through gunpowder technology, just like the Muslim gunpowder empires. Now, as a result of this conquest, we see cultural diffusion. We know that cultural diffusion happens through conquest and trade. So the Russian religion of Christianity is going to spread due to this conquest. And it's also going to spread the fur trade throughout the East. In fact, they make it so far east that by 1741, the Russians reached the New World through Alaska. Remember that up in Canada, there was a lot of fur trade going on, with the French taking advantage of that fur trade. So Russia is going to try and get involved in the New World as well. Are we good so far? So here we have Ivan the Terrifying, Ivan IV. Here he is depicted in traditional Russian dress. It's very cold, so it makes sense that they would wear long coats with lots of fur and a hat and gloves and boots. When the Romanov dynasty takes over after the time of troubles, Peter the First, okay, Peter the Great, is going to try to westernize Russia. Remember, Russia didn't have a Renaissance because they were under Mongol control at the time. So Russia is behind culturally. Peter the Great is going to try to modernize Russia, westernize Russia, and make it more like Europe. So Peter the Great is going to say, no more long coats. In Europe, where it's warmer, they wear their coats to their knees. So he'll even cut people's coats to their knees. He's going to say no more beards, because in Europe, they don't wear beards. They have nice little mustaches. And Peter the Great gets so mad whenever someone comes in front of him with a beard that he's known for ripping it out with his bare hands. Okay, so Ivan IV, very traditional conservative Russian culture. By the time Peter the Great comes along, that's going to change significantly as he tries to copy what Europe is doing. Okay, so later dynasty, Peter is going to come to power. So what did Ivan do that was good? Well, during his good period, he was married to Anastasia Romanov. This is not the same Anastasia from the Disney movie. Okay, that Anastasia lived around World War I, lived and died around World War I, because she was actually killed with her family, unlike what it says in the movie. So this is a different Anastasia. Okay, World War I was in the 1900s. We're 400 years away from that. Okay, Anastasia just happens to be a common Russian name. So like his grandfather, Ivan the Terrible is going to extend the empire, make it bigger, and he's going to build infrastructure to legitimize his rule. He builds schools, churches, and hospitals. Okay, so in that expansion, here's where Russia started. Muscovy, with the capital in Moscow. That's under Ivan III. Then you're going to see that expansion under this lighter blue area as we move from Ivan III through Vasily. And then here in green is where we see Ivan IV's territory added on. Okay, so Russia is going to very rapidly expand east. But Ivan IV is also going to move them west, with the main goal being acquiring a warm water port. And y'all, this is going to be a big continuity in Russian history. If there's ever a question for why did Russia do that? Why did they go to war? Why did they do this, that, the other? It's probably because they want a warm water port. Okay, that's probably going to be the biggest reason behind any war or any battle that they fight. Because remember, they have access to a lot of land-based trade, like the Silk Road, but during period 2, land-based trade wasn't popping. It was maritime trade. That's where everybody was trying to get in on. So Russia wants in on the maritime trade. Well, they're pretty much landlocked. And Russia is very cold. So the ports they did have in like northern Russia in Siberia, for about half the year, those ports were frozen over. No boats coming in, no boats going out, because it's a block of ice. And so they wanted access to a warm water port, like in the Baltic Sea, because this would enable them to do maritime trade for the whole year, rather than half the year, because their ports would freeze over, but their warm water port in the Baltic Sea wouldn't. Okay, so that's going to be a major continuity that you need to remember for Russia. Almost everything they do is because they want that warm water port. So if you had a good period, what's the bad period? Why is he called Ivan the Terrible? Well, y'all remember the secret police that he used to help maintain rule? he's going to go a little crazy with the Oprichnina. Okay, it's not entirely his fault. I mean, his wife gets poisoned in an assassination attempt, and that makes him really paranoid. And so he sends out his Oprichnina, and he's like, find out who's trying to kill me. Use torture if you have to. Well, the problem with using torture is that if you torture someone enough, they're going to tell you whatever they think you want to hear. You might be like, tell us who else is involved in the plan. And they'll start naming people that they knew from like elementary school, just because like you're pulling out their toenails. And so they get a lot of information that may not have been true, but the Oprichnina still hunt these people down. And so thousands of people are going to be killed due to Ivan IV's paranoia over assassination attempts. And it's not just people he perceives as enemies that are killed, it's his own family. He accidentally kills his own son in 1581 in a fit of rage. Now, how this happened was his son was married and his wife was pregnant with Ivan the Terrible's grandchild. Well, his daughter-in-law, who's pregnant, shows up to a dance and she's wearing a dress that he doesn't like. He thinks it's showing off too much. It's not modest enough. So he beats her. In the process of that beating, she loses the baby. So obviously his son is super, super ticked off. So his son goes to confront his dad for beating his pregnant wife. And Ivan IV doesn't really like that his son's talking back to him, so he beats him too, accidentally killing him. Okay, so here it is depicted in art. You see the struggle in the painting with the chair knocked over and the rug messed up and his walking cane that he hit him with over the head. And then you can see the horror and remorse in Ivan IV's face as he realizes what he's done, killing his only son, his only heir to the throne. So that makes a really big political problem. If there's no heir, who's supposed to rule when Ivan IV dies? And that question doesn't get answered for a decade after Ivan IV dies. Instead, they go into a period of anarchy known as the Time of Troubles, before they get together in a group and they're like, okay, we need a leader. Let's vote on somebody, anybody, because the Time of Troubles, this ain't it. Now, one of the good things that he did during his bad period was he built St. Basil's Cathedral. Okay, this was a way to legitimize his power, tying his power to religion. You build a fancy church, that shows that you and the church are united. That supports the theory of divine right. I'm in charge because God wants me in charge, and God wants me to be an absolute ruler. So here is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Now, we do see some cultural syncretism in this architecture. Okay, remember, syncretism is different from diffusion. Syncretism is the creation of something new, like Arabic mixing with the Bantu language in Africa to create Swahili along the eastern coast. That's syncretism. Arabic being spoken in Africa isn't syncretism. That's cultural diffusion. It means Arabic traveled from the Arabian Peninsula into Africa. But when it blends with something else to create something new, that's syncretism. And so here we see the combination of Roman heritage and Eastern heritage, particularly from India and the Islamic religion. What from this cathedral comes from Rome? What architectural feature? The dome, exactly. The dome comes from Rome. Okay, and you also see arches that come from Rome as well. Now, what's interesting about these domes is that they reflect the more Eastern version of domes. Okay, they look more like Hershey's Kisses, right? Another influence we get from the East is the colors used in painting this church and the geometric patterns. You see triangles and half circles, okay, and squares throughout this infrastructure. So you combine aspects of the Roman heritage, domes and arches, with aspects of Russia's Eastern heritage, influence from India, and geometric patterns from Islam, because remember, Islam was iconoclastic, so they focused on geometric patterns instead of paintings or pictures of deities or religious figures. And so we see the creation of something new. This is Eurasia. It's not purely Europe or purely Asia. It's a combination of the two, which is what Russia is. Are we good so far? All right. Then when we return tomorrow, remember, we're meeting Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Asynchronous Thursday for your test, asynchronous Friday. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to talk about the time of troubles, when Ivan IV dies and does not have an heir to rule Russia, and how Russia figures that problem out. Then we'll move on to the Romanov Dynasty, like talking about Peter the Great and the Westernization of Russia. Peter the Great decides to make Russia more European rather than Asian, and that's where we get Westernization. Okay, what caused the time of troubles in Russia? They didn't have a strong leader. Well, wait a minute. They had the Rurik Dynasty, where they had gotten Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, who are Ivan III and Ivan IV. What happened to the Rurik Dynasty? How did it end? I'll give you a hint. Y'all remember going over this painting?
Yes.
Okay, so what's depicted in this painting? Good. Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, killed his only heir in a fit of rage, meaning no heir to rule over Russia once Ivan IV died. Okay, so that means the Rurik Dynasty is done for. It is dead. And so you have a state of anarchy and chaos that results from that. This supports Thomas Hobbes' argument about absolute government. Remember, Thomas Hobbes said that in a natural state, we enter into a period of chaos and anarchy. The only way to end it is to have a strong leader. Hence why absolute rule is the best rule, according to Thomas Hobbes. So this would actually support his thesis that an absolute ruler is necessary, because once they didn't have a strong absolute ruler, they enter into the time of troubles. And it lasts for 10 years until the Zemsky Sobor, which is a collection of Russian nobles, met to declare a new czar. They decided upon Michael Romanov. And so the Rurik Dynasty is replaced by the Romanov Dynasty. And this dynasty is going to be the longest lasting dynasty in Europe. This one family rules Russia for over 300 years, from 1613 until World War I, when the last of the Romanov family are assassinated and the Soviet Union begins in Russia. So up until the modern age, the Romanov dynasty is going to be in charge of Russia. And they're going to rule as absolute monarchs. They have full autocratic control, okay, meaning that they decrease the power of the nobles in order to increase the power of the Tsar. Like the Rurik leaders, Ivan III and Ivan IV, the leaders of the Romanov dynasty are going to continue to make Russia bigger. They're going to take more and more territory, often in search of their warm water ports so that they can engage in maritime trade. Also, most notably, Westernization occurs under the Romanov dynasty. Westernization is another word for modernization. This is going to lead to a series of changes in Russia. So change over time, one of our historical thinking skills. One of the main leaders of the Westernization movement in Russia is Peter the Great of the Romanov dynasty. He is going to cement Russia as a Western country, a European country, an empire, rather than as an Asian country, an empire. Remember that Russia was smack dab in the middle of Europe and Asia. They could have gone either way. They had influence from the Mongols, they had influence from the Vikings. Peter the Great is going to lean Russia more towards the West as he tries to modernize Russia to get them caught up to the rest of Europe. Because remember, while the rest of Europe was going through their Renaissance, Russia was still under Mongol control. So he sees that they are behind, that they're archaic, and he wants to get them caught up to the rest of the modern world. You can even see that in this depiction of him, where he copies Western fashion, including the shaving off of his beard. He is going to get rid of beards in Russia. Y'all may remember Ivan IV had a very long, scraggly beard, and he had very thick clothing and coats because of the weather. Peter the Great is going to say, nah, we need to copy France. We need to copy Europe and become more like them to catch up with the modern world. He even bans beards and says that if you want to wear a beard, you're going to have to pay the government for the right to grow your own facial hair. He institutes something called a beard tax. And then if you show up to his court, there are barbers waiting outside his palace to shave your face before you go in and see him. And if you refuse and you show up in front of him with a beard, he was known to go into fits of rage and literally grab the beard with his bare hands and rip it off of their faces, like a waxing treatment, but incredibly painful and scary, because wearing a beard was seen as going against his absolute rule. He said, beards are no longer cool. We're doing the European thing, clean shaven with a little fancy mustache. So if you don't follow his rules, it's likely that he will punish you for that. So very autocratic, used to being an absolute ruler. Now, in absolutism, we know that the church plays a key role in legitimizing the rule of absolute monarchs. That's because absolutism is characterized by divine right theory, okay? But the church is also characterized by adhering to tradition. So where are they going to fall in terms of Westernization? Well, the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is not going to be a big fan of Westernization, okay? They want to preserve traditional, my pen's not working, traditional beliefs and values. Okay, they are going to be against Westernization. You have a lot of old believers in the church who promote Russian culture, traditional Russian culture. Okay, this is known as Slavophilism. Slav referring to the Slavic peoples, including the Russians. Phil referring to love. So this is love of traditional Russian culture. They don't want to change. They want continuities. Well, the Tsar wants change. The Tsar wants Westernization. And so he and the church are going to butt heads over the church wanting to remain traditional and the Tsar wanting to become modern. Okay? He's also going to want to rule absolutely. That's going to put him in conflict with the boyars. Remember, the boyars are the Russian nobles. They are concerned with getting and keeping power. Remember, there is a constant power struggle. This is a continuity. There's a constant power struggle between the nobles and absolute rulers, because the nobles want to increase their power and the absolute rulers want to increase their own power. So they're at odds with each other. So Peter the Great is going to be fighting the boyars over Westernization and power, and he's going to be fighting the church over Westernization and power. So he's going to undermine both of those groups in order to modernize Russia. One of the ways that he does this with the church is that he gets rid of the position of the patriarch. Y'all may remember that the patriarch is the leader of the Orthodox Church. They don't have a pope. They have a patriarch who is picked by the emperor or the czar. Well, when the patriarch dies, Peter the Great says, I'm not going to pick a new one. I'm going to get rid of the patriarch. And this is going to tick off the old believers because the patriarch typically supported traditional beliefs and values. So what is Peter the Great going to replace the patriarch with? He's going to replace them with the Holy Synod, which is a group, a committee of people handpicked by the Tsar to run the church. And so really the Tsar runs the church through the Holy Synod, because the church becomes a branch of the government that he controls through this committee. And so he is going to increase his power at the expense of the church. He's also going to increase his power by changing the rules of who can join the church as a member of the clergy. He's going to say that if you want to become a monk in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you have to be at least 50 years old. He says before you can become a monk, during your youth, when you're young and strong, you should instead be a soldier. You should join the military. If you live long enough, then you can retire and join the church. Okay, so this is cutting off recruitment for the church and increasing recruitment for the military, which the Tsar controls, which is going to increase his own power. Okay, but the boyars also make up a large part of the military. So he has to try and decrease their power. He does this by instituting the table of ranks. Before the table of ranks, before Peter the Great, high-ranking members in the military got their high ranks, not because they're good at their job, but because they were nobles, because they had a title, because their daddy knew somebody, because they had money that they could throw around. Now, does that make a very strong or effective military? No. If you just give people titles like major and colonel because they simply want the title and because they were born into a noble family, you're not going to be really great at fighting battles. And so in order to decrease the power that nobles have in the military and thus increase his own power, Peter the Great is going to institute the table of ranks. Instead of rising in position based on your social status or your money, instead, this is going to be a meritocracy, where you rise in position or are promoted based on your merits, based on your qualifications, based on how well you can do your job. This is similar to what we saw in China with the civil service exam. Instead of getting a position in the government because your parents are rich, instead you have to take a very difficult exam to make sure you know enough in order to run the government effectively. Okay, so he institutes a meritocracy in the military. This decreases the power of the boyars and increases the power of the Tsar. And this is going to be important because Peter is going to face a military coup that's led by boyars, known as the Streltsy. So he is very keen to keep an eye on the military to make sure that the nobles can't overthrow him. And that's going to be our next topic of how Peter the Great rose to power in the first place. Does anybody need this whiteboard? All right, so I'm going to move us back to Peter the Great, open up the chat. Okay, excellent. So Peter had to share his throne with his other siblings. His father had 2 wives, okay, and he had 3 children. Okay, so his father had 2 children from his first wife, a daughter and a son. And then he had Peter with his second wife. So Sophia, the daughter, and the brother from the first wife inherit the throne after Peter's dad dies. Now, Peter's older brother, his half-brother, wasn't all there. He wasn't very mentally competent. And so Sophia, his sister, is going to manipulate the brother. She's going to control the brother so that she can rule through him. Because as a woman in traditional Russia, okay, she didn't have a lot of power. So she uses her older brother to rule in his stead. Okay, so she's sharing power with the older brother. But then the older brother dies. Now it's Peter's time to rule. And Sophia can't control Peter the same way she controlled her full brother. Okay, and so she can't control her half-brother, so she tries to get rid of her half-brother. She gets nobles in the military, known as the Streltsy, to try to host a military coup to kill Peter the First. Now that coup is going to be unsuccessful. And so Peter is going to put his half-sister in a convent as punishment. He doesn't kill her, but he puts her in a very boring prison. A convent is where nuns live. So it's just going to be a bunch of praying and Bible study. And so he takes her off the board, okay, so that she can't be a threat to him anymore. Then he is going to execute the Streltsy. He's going to kill the nobles that were a part of this military coup to keep him from power. Okay, so trying to control the boyars in order to increase his own power. And he is going to rule until 1725. During his rule, he is going to visit Europe, and he's going to spend a year touring around Europe and taking in all of the information and the modernization that they have to offer. Now, he goes in disguise, like he doesn't tell people, I'm the Tsar of Russia. He's just like, oh, I'm, Pedro from blah, 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 blah. But everyone knows it's him. The dude is 7 feet tall. So there's no disguise that's going to be able to fool people into thinking he's anything other than the Russian Tsar. But he goes touring around Europe, learning about shipyards and how to build ships, learning about dentistry, learning about different scientific branches, learning about, Enlightenment ideals. And he takes all this information back to Russia. And he tries to force it through Russia to get Russia caught up to the rest of Europe. Okay, and he's going to succeed in that Westernization. But first, he has to take care of the threat to his power. He's gotten his sister off the board by placing her in a convent. What is he going to do with the Streltsy? He is going to execute them publicly and brutally. Okay, pikes on heads, beheadings, starvation. He's going to hang some of them up in metal cages in the wilderness to die in the elements, to die either of starvation, exhaustion, or hypothermia. And what's further, he's not going to take them down and bury them. He's going to leave them up in these cages all winter. And then when the spring comes and they thaw, the animals will eat them, and the bones and the meat and everything will rot out of the cages. The reason he does this is to send a message. This message is, if you try to overthrow me, you better succeed on the first try, or else this is going to be you. So this is a message to anybody who would try to overthrow him. Okay, I will return with brutal force to eliminate any and all of my enemies. Does that make sense so far? So with this policy of Westernization, he is going to try to copy Western Europe as much as possible. That includes culturally, in terms of dress and appearance. He's going to change the fashion of Russia to mirror that of France in particular, because France is in the middle of its golden age under Louis XIV. Also by banning beards, with the exception of a beard tax. So if you pay the tax, you're allowed to grow your facial hair. But if you are presented to the Tsar, you better not have any facial hair other than a fashionable French mustache, or he will rip it out of your face. He broke church control by replacing the patriarch with the Holy Synod, thus making the church a part of the government, a branch of the government that he controlled. So he's increasing his own power, increasing his absolute rule by controlling the church to back up the divine right theory. He's also going to break noble power by promoting education, establishing colleges so that nobles are not the only ones with access to education, by ending corruption in the military and instituting a meritocracy where you rise in status based on your qualifications and based on how well you do your job, rather than based on how much money or status you have. He also increases the number of soldiers Russia has by putting an age requirement on joining the church. You have to be an old man to join the church, 50 or older. If you're younger than 50, then you should be a soldier fighting for Russia. And he's going to use this new military, this bigger military, to conquer land in Europe, specifically from Sweden. When he conquers that land from Sweden, he's going to establish a new capital. He's going to move the capital of Russia from Moscow further west to St. Petersburg, which obviously he named after himself. This capital becomes his window to the west, increasing access to European modernization and ideas. It also gives him access to a warm water port on the Baltic Sea, which, remember, is a continuity in Russian history. They always want a warm water port because land trade is out. Okay, yes, Russia has access to the Silk Road and all this land trade, but maritime trade is what's popping. Well, you can't trade if your ships are all frozen in place in ice during the winter. So you need a warm water port if you're going to trade throughout the year. Okay, so in the Great Northern War, he is going to spend 20 years fighting Sweden so he can get this warm water port. In terms of women's rights, he's going to notice that women act differently in Europe compared to Russia. Remember, Russia was very conservative and traditional. Women could be forced into marriages. Women wore veils, okay, dating back to heritage from Mesopotamia and Asian influences. And women could not interact with men outside of their family. When Peter comes back from Europe and westernizes Russia, he's going to outlaw forced marriages. He's going to make women able to go in public without veils. And now women can interact with men outside of their family. Because when he goes to Versailles in France, he sees women dancing with men, playing cards with men, eating with men, talking with men outside their family. And remember, he wants Russia to be more like France in particular. And so he's going to bring those changes back. So women's rights are going to increase in Russia during this time. The population is also going to increase due to the Columbian Exchange, the arrival of potatoes. Okay, where did potatoes originate? Where'd they come from? The New World. Once they come from the New World, they're going to become very popular in Europe, leading to a population boom, including in Russia. Remember, potatoes could be buried underground to grow. So the cold winter of Russia doesn't affect potatoes as much. It means that there's more land that's suitable for farming due to this new crop. You also get the new manufactured good of vodka from the distillation of potatoes. And that's going to be a very popular alcoholic drink in Russia. So even the Columbian Exchange has a huge effect on Russia, even though Russia was not colonizing in the Columbian Exchange. Plus, a bigger population means more soldiers for your military, which is going to contribute to the expansion of Russia as it continues to grow in size. Are we good so far? Excellent. So here's a political cartoon depicting Peter the Great, Peter the First, cutting off the beards of his nobles. Okay, so if they're wearing a beard, then that indicates that they are a part of the old believers. Remember that the old believers rejected Westernization. And so Peter the Great tried to force through Westernization, tried to undermine the old believers in the traditional Russian Orthodox Church through the elimination of the patriarch position and the institution of the Holy Synod, bringing religion under his power, bringing the military under his power, so he could rule absolutely. Are we good so far? Remember that in building the military, he instituted the table of ranks, increasing people's position in the military based on how good they were at their job. So instead of getting a position based on who your daddy is or how much money you are as a noble, now you have to actually work for that higher status. The effect of this is that it's going to lower the power of the boyars and thus increase the power of the czar. Okay, there is a constant power struggle between these two groups, the nobles and absolute monarchs. I cannot emphasize that enough. So now, instead of a military that's focused on corruption and only fulfilling the basic necessities of your contract, now people are going to go above and beyond because there's a reward for going above and beyond and being good at your job. Similarity to Genghis Khan influence from the Mongols? Yes. Okay, Genghis Khan tightly controlled the military and how it was regimented in order to break up tribal ties so that the military would be loyal to him instead of loyal to their tribe. So yeah, you could see influence from the Mongols in this table of ranks, or you could compare it to the civil service exam in China, because instead of promoting people in the government based on who their parents were, in China, you had to pass this very difficult exam based on Confucianist thought in order to get those cushy jobs in the government, okay, making the scholar gentry higher in status than the nobility in China. Are we good so far? Now, even though Peter the Great does all of this cool stuff, he's not going to be perfect, right? Like the Ivans of the Rurik Dynasty, like Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, he is going to have a bad side and a big temper. He's very crude. He's very violent. Okay, he would rip the beards off of people's faces for disrespecting him. He would, if you mentioned to him, oh yeah, my tooth hurts, you know, blah, 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 he would sit you down, force your mouth open and pull the tooth out himself. Because remember, he studied dentistry in Europe. When he found out his wife was cheating on him, he killed her lover, put his head in a jar, pickled it, and put it on her nightstand table and forced her to look at it every night before she went to bed. Okay, so Peter the Great does not play. He will get you if you tick him off. That included his own son. His son disobeyed his wishes by marrying a woman that Peter didn't want him to marry. And so his son, Alexis, and his best friends and wife flee to Germany. They flee the country because they know that he's ticked off. Well, his son is supposed to be the next czar. That is not a good look for the government if the guy who's going to one day control the country flees the country. And so Peter the Great writes to his son and he's like, Alexis, come home. I promise I won't kill you. So Alexis is like, okay, I'm going to take that at face value. And he takes his best friends. He leaves his wife behind. He and his best friends who helped him escape go back to Russia to talk to his dad. Well, as soon as they land in Russia, Alexis is arrested and Peter kills all of his friends. He's like, well, if you look at the letter, I promise not to kill you. Didn't say anything about your friends who helped you commit treason. So Alexis is not very popular in Russia because he kind of, you know, dissed Russia by leaving it over some lady. Okay, and so there's a lot of public demand for his execution. Peter doesn't want to execute one of his sons, so he turns it over to the Holy Synod and says, hold a trial, and then whatever decision you have, I'll uphold. Well, the Holy Synod bows to public pressure and issues the guilty verdict with the punishment of execution. And so Peter the Great ends up accidentally killing his son through this execution for treason because he turned it over to the Holy Synod. He didn't stop the trial from taking place. Well, does this mean that the Romanov dynasty ends? No, because Peter has other sons. This was just his firstborn. It was his eldest son. Okay, so the Romanov dynasty continues. But even family members aren't safe from his wrath. Even though he's going to build up the military in Russia and make Russia bigger and make it modern, this isn't going to be awesome for everybody. Being a serf in Russia still sucks, especially since you're still doing forced labor. But now, in addition to agricultural forced labor, you're doing industrial forced labor, like the building of new shipyards for the new Russian Navy. Okay, so more work on the serfs. They're still forced to work. Also, the government needs more money to build these shipyards and Peter's new palace in St. Petersburg. And so they're going to increase taxes on the peasants and serfs, much like the French increased taxes on the third estate. Now remember, the peasants and serfs don't have a lot of money, but they're not a threat to the Tsar. Remember, his power struggles are with the boyars and the church. Those are what threaten him. He doesn't care about making the serfs happy. And since the serfs benefit the boyars, he's just going to leave them alone. He's going to continue serfdom in Russia. So some of those Enlightenment ideals, like life, liberty, and property, he doesn't bring back with him to Russia and institute, because that would undermine his absolute rule. Are we good so far? All right. So one of his biggest military campaigns is going to be fighting a Western European country. He's going to fight Sweden for 2 decades over a warm water port. Remember, I cannot emphasize the importance of a warm water port. He wants Russia to be more Western, so he takes some Western European land from Sweden. After 100,000 deaths and 20 years of fighting, Russia ends up winning in this great Northern War. So they get new territory in the Baltic Sea, they get a warm water port, and Peter decides that he wants a more Western capital. He moves the capital of Russia from Moscow, from the Kremlin, to the new capital, which he names after himself, St. Petersburg. And at St. Petersburg, he's going to build Peter Hof, Peter's house, or the Winter Palace. And he's going to base it on the Palace of Versailles, because he had visited Versailles. He's also going to copy Louis XIV's policy of maintaining control over the nobles. Like Louis XIV, Peter I is going to have the boyars live at his Winter Palace with him throughout the year so he can keep an eye on them. He is copying France because France is the superpower in Europe at this time. Does that make sense so far? So looking at how Russia expanded. Here's Russia before the Great Northern War. Here's the territory that they gain after the Great Northern War, and that gives them direct access to the warm water Baltic Sea. So they become a major power in the Baltic. Then Peter moves the capital from Moscow, which, remember, the original capital had been in Kiev. Then it's moved to Moscow, which is considered the third Rome, because Rome fell in 476 and Constantinople fell in 1453. Now he's moving it as far west as it's ever been, to St. Petersburg, the window to the west, amplifying the European ties that Russia has, rather than emphasizing its ties to its Asian influences to the east. But they're not just going to expand west into Europe. He's also going to expand the Russian Empire east, more warm water ports over here. So Russia has become a very, very large land empire. It is a large land gunpowder empire. Okay, much like the Mughal dynasty in India, the Safavid in Iraq and Iran, and the Ottoman in the former Byzantine Empire are also gunpowder empires. It's just that the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman empires are Muslim. The Russian gunpowder empire is Christian. Are we good so far? So looking at that Winter Palace, he's basically going to copy what he saw in Versailles. Very elaborate decor, sculptures, fountains, everything's covered in gold and marble, very manicured gardens for everybody to entertain themselves at this palace. Paintings on the ceilings, expensive tiles, gold gilding everywhere. I guess if you have enough money, you just run out of things to buy, so you end up making fountain statues of a merman fighting an alligator. It's like, you do you, however you want to decorate your space. And so all of this is going to be copying what he sees in Europe. He wants to be an absolute ruler, like Louis XIV of France was an absolute ruler. And so he copies a lot of what he sees under the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, so what is the legacy of Peter the Great? Well, now Russia is a world power. They are caught up. They are powerful. They are a part of Europe. They have westernized and modernized to catch up with Europe. He has strengthened the military and weakened the nobles through the establishment of a military meritocracy. But not everything is going to be awesome under Peter the Great. Serfdom continues. That's a continuity. It becomes stronger. It becomes harder for the serfs. They're not only forced to work on farms, but they're also forced to work on shipyards, okay, industrialization for building up Russian maritime trade. They're still going to be taxed very heavily to fund this westernization, okay? So serfdom is not going to end until we get to the modern period in 1861. So it's still very strong under the absolute rulers of the czars. Now, when Peter the Great dies, he leaves his throne to his second wife, Catherine I. He does have children that it passes down to, but first he leaves it to his wife, okay? Keep in mind, Peter I was married to Catherine I. This is different from what we're talking about tomorrow, where Peter III of Russia was married to Catherine II. Peter I is Peter the Great. Catherine II is Catherine the Great. Different Peters, different Catherines. It's critically important that you know the difference with the Roman numerals. Peter the Great, also known as Peter I. Now, it's important to keep these Roman numerals in mind, and I'll tell you why. Because there are a lot of Peters in Russian history. There are a lot of Catherines in Russian history. You need to be familiar with the Roman numeral in order to make sure that you're talking about the same one. Okay, so Peter I was married to Catherine I. He was Peter the Great. She was not Catherine the Great. That's a different Catherine. Catherine the Great was Catherine II. And she wasn't even Russian. She was German, but she was married to Peter III, who was decidedly not great. He was terrible. He was a man-child, okay? And so it's important for you to note, Peter I, Catherine I, they were the couple. Peter was the great one in that. Catherine II and Peter III, they were a couple. And Catherine II was the great one. Okay, so keep that in mind. Catherine the Great is going to be a lot like Peter the Great in that she is going to continue the process of westernization or modernization of Russia, because she is going to rule as an enlightened despot. Okay, she is the Zarina of Russia. Okay, and she rules after her husband mysteriously dies. Okay, she was married to Peter III, who was actually Russian. She came from Germany. Okay, she was an educated German princess who was Protestant. But when she marries into the Romanov family, she converts to Russian Orthodoxy. And she tries to become as Russian as possible, because her husband isn't really that great of a ruler. He's very childish. Like, he still liked to play with toys, even up into adulthood. Like, he would have little toy soldiers, you know, like made out of metal and painted. He would even play with his toys in bed. Like, can you just imagine like rolling over and you get poked by a toy soldier with a spear? Okay, so that was really annoying for her. He would even play with Russian soldiers, like real soldiers. He would make them come into his courtyard and he would like give them orders to like march around, and he would pretend he was a general, like real childish stuff. Then he cheated on her extensively, even inviting his mistresses into their home and to formal dinners and embarrassing her publicly in front of other diplomats. So overall, he was just pretty much a turd of a person, right? And she felt that she could be a much better ruler. And so she quietly had him assassinated under mysterious circumstances, which allowed her as the queen regent to take over. Okay, and so she is going to become the sole ruler of Russia after the assassination of her husband. And now she is going to be ruling as an enlightened despot. What this means is she is enlightened. She takes ideals from the Enlightenment, from Western Europe, and tries to implement them into Russia. Okay, so ideas like life, liberty, property. But what about that pesky right to rebel? What about that whole pro-democracy, voting people into power thing? Is she going to be pro that? No. Hence the despot part of the title. She is still going to retain absolute rule. She wants to be an absolute ruler. No elections, no parliament, no sharing of power. She's still an autocrat. So that's where we get the despot part of this statement. However, she is going to make advancements and modernizations, okay, that earn her the enlightened title. Does that make sense so far? In terms of what she did as an enlightened ruler, like many great rulers, like Justinian the Great with his Justinian Code, or Vladimir I with the Russkaya Pravda, she is going to attempt to codify and modernize the law system, okay? In that law system, she is going to end the use of torture, because that torture kind of violates the whole life and liberty part of natural rights, and she's going to end the use of torture, which was a very common method used by Russian czars. Y'all may remember Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV. He had his own secret police, the Oprichnina. Y'all may remember Peter the Great. He tortured and executed the Streltsy for their role in the coup led by his sister. But she's going to try to dampen down on that part of Russian history and become more modern. Other major successes included her continuing to expand Russia. So that's a continuity in Russian history, is that it keeps getting bigger. And what are the Russians searching for as they expand? What is their goal? What do they usually want to get from that expansion? Good, TJ and Callahan. Warm water ports. Okay, so she's going to continue to expand the size of this empire. She's also going to increase education for girls, which is a huge change in Russia. Okay, it'll move away from its traditional beliefs and values. Remember that Peter the Great increased women's rights by ending forced marriage and allowing women to interact freely with men outside of their family. Now they're becoming educated. She's also going to help the population of Russia through smallpox inoculations. And y'all, inoculations are like an early rudimentary form of vaccination. Okay, nowadays we get vaccinations in shots. It's all very medical and sterile. Back then, how they inoculated was they would take pus from a pustule, from smallpox or black plague or whatever it was, and they would attempt to denature the DNA. So they would try to kill the virus. Denaturing DNA is often accomplished through heating up the DNA. Okay, so once they've killed the virus, they then cut open someone's hand or make a cut somewhere on their body, and then they take that pus that they just got from a smallpox pustule and they rub it in the cut. Okay, introducing the weakened or dead virus to your immune system. So then your immune system reacts with white blood cells that go and attack this dead virus, and the virus can't fight back. And so obviously your immune system is going to win in that fight. Well, how does that prevent you from getting smallpox later when it's not a dead form of the virus? Because your body has produced antibodies, okay? And so this inoculation was a way to end the spread of smallpox by giving people a much weaker version of the disease, or a dead form of the disease, so that their body could naturally build up its immune system to it. However, people are going to be kind of suspicious about inoculations. Like if you just go through like the logic of it of, oh, I'm going to prevent myself from getting a disease by giving myself the disease, there are going to be some people, especially in the noble class and the peasant class, that are going to say, yeah, that doesn't make sense. I'm not letting you cut me and rub smallpox pus on me. So how does she get over the naysayers who say this doesn't work? Well, she inoculates herself and her entire family. So the future czars of Russia are inoculated against smallpox, and they all survive. And so that's going to lead to a boost in popularity for the inoculations because it's deemed as safe. Okay. And so, like Peter the Great, she is going to continue to westernize Russia, but she's going to come into some conflict with that. Number one, the autocratic ruler always has a power struggle with the nobles. Okay, the nobles always want to increase their power. So even though she's westernizing, and Western Europe had already ended serfdom earlier than Russia, she's not going to be able to end serfdom because the nobles need it, and she needs the nobles. So she needs their influence in order to remain in power. But she's also going to face pushback from the church, because the church is full of people who believe in Slavophilism. Okay, Slavo referring to Russian culture and traditions, filio referring to love. Now, who do we call the people who believed in Slavophilism that were a part of the Orthodox Church? The old believers. Good, Naomi. The old believers, dating back all the way to when Peter the Great was in power, Peter the First. So the old believers, how are they going to feel about medical advances and girls getting educated? Not so good. They're going to be against this. Okay, so she's going to be fighting the church, just like Peter the Great did, but she's going to be relying more heavily on the boyars, okay, for their support to maintain her power. Okay, that means that serfdom, even though by this time it's ended in Western Europe due to the Enlightenment, it is going to be a continuity in Russian history all the way up until 1861. Now, we said that Russia got bigger. So where did it expand? Well, notably expanded into Europe. It expanded specifically into Poland. But there were other countries in Europe that wanted that territory, namely Prussia and Austria, okay, close to the Holy Roman Empire. And so Catherine the Great works out a deal with Prussia and Austria to divide up Poland amongst the three of them. This is called the partition of Poland. Partition meaning cutting into parts. So these three powers divided up Poland amongst each other. And the effect of that is that Poland is not going to be its own independent country until the 1900s. And then, of course, after they become an independent country, all they want to do is exist. But Germany and Russia are going to continue to invade them over and over again in World War I and in World War II. So we're going to see some conflict there. Now, not everything that Catherine the Great did was super woke or great. Okay, she is going to discriminate against the Jewish population. In particular, she segregates Jewish populations into an area of Poland/Russia called the Pale of Settlement. Okay, this is where Jewish people are going to be forced to live separate from the Orthodox Russian people. Okay, now remember that the Jews have a long history, an unfortunate history of being forced through diasporas and discrimination. Okay, the Jewish diaspora out of Jerusalem and into Europe. Sephardic Jews had lived peacefully in the Al-Andalus, okay, the Iberian Peninsula. They'd lived in Spain and Portugal peacefully under the Umayyad Dynasty until 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella took over and began the Reconquista. Okay, under the Reconquista, the Sephardic Jews and Muslims were kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula, so continuing the diaspora. In Germany and Poland, you have the Ashkenazi Jews. They too are going to continue to face discrimination as a result of their belief system. But it's not just Lutherans, it's not just Catholics, it's not just Orthodox, okay? There is a long continuity of discrimination against the Jewish population. And this is going to lead to an increase in hate crimes against the Jews, including pogroms. That's an O. Okay. Pogroms would be hate crimes against like the Pale of the Settlement, where people would go into Jewish neighborhoods and set them on fire and kidnap people and kill people. Okay. And so that is going to, I'll try to spell that more clearly. That is going to be an unfortunate part of history under Catherine the Great's rule. Okay, remember, the Enlightenment was like, okay, we're pro religious beliefs, okay, pro religious toleration. Okay, that's the statement, but that's not always going to be the reality that we see. Are we good so far? Now, expansion is expensive. Okay, and as Russia expands, it's going to need to raise taxes to fund that expansion. And it's also going to need a large labor supply to work on the land that they've conquered for agricultural purposes. So serfdom is going to get worse under Catherine the Great, despite her Enlightenment ideas. In fact, it's going to be even worse than serfdom that existed in Western Europe. Okay, so comparing the two, Russian serfdom is the worst of the two. And it's going to continue for such a long time because it benefits the government and it benefits the nobility. So it benefits the people in power. So 1/3 of the entire Russian population is going to be made up of serfs. They're going to be taxed very highly. They're going to have very few rights. All right. And they're going to be a form of free or coerced labor. So how does serfdom benefit the government? Well, it keeps the peasants controlled. Okay, so controlling the peasants. How does it benefit the nobility? They get free labor. And Russia, as it expands, is agricultural. You don't see a lot of industry in Russia. Okay, they're behind Europe. So they're not going to have the Industrial Revolution right off of the bat. And so because Russia is more agricultural, it is more likely to need serf labor. So it's going to continue in this cycle, okay? And the conditions of serfdom are going to get worse and worse and deteriorate. Eventually, the serfs are going to be tired of the high taxes, not having enough rights, and the coerced labor. And eventually, they're going to try to use their numbers in their favor because they make up a large segment of the Russian population. This culminates in the Pugachev Rebellion. Now, Pugachev was the name of the leader of this rebellion, and he had gone around Russia telling people that he was Peter III. Now, who is Peter III again? Why would he claim to be Peter III? Who dat? Catherine II's husband. Exactly right. The last Tsar of Russia. But wait, I thought that Peter III had died. Well, Pugachev went around saying, I'm Peter III. My wife tried to kill me and I survived the assassination attempt. So now I'm going around Russia trying to raise an army. And if you help me, I'll end serfdom. So really, he's trying to grab power for himself. He knew full well that he wasn't Peter III. But if he's going to need an army, he needs to raise that army. And so he used that as his way of starting this rebellion. And it's going to be made up not only of serfs, but also Cossacks, which y'all may remember are Russian cowboys. These were escaped serfs that lived in the wilderness. They fought as mercenaries, meaning they fought for pay. And sometimes they'd even fought for the Russian government if they were paying them. But now they're rising up to fight against the Russian government. Now, unfortunately for the serfs, but fortunately for Catherine, this rebellion is going to fail. Okay, Catherine calls upon the boyars, okay, the nobles, and says, look, the serfs are rebelling. We need to put them down, because if they take me out, then who do you think's next? They're going to take you out. So Catherine and the nobles team up to fight against the serfs, much like we saw in the Peasants' Rebellion with Luther, where the Catholics and the Lutherans sided together against the nobles, okay, because class trumped religion. And this rebellion is going to fail. In response to this rebellion, serfdom is going to get even worse. The oppression of the peasants is going to increase because the government recognizes they need to keep tight control of this population in order to prevent another rebellion from happening and then succeeding. Does that make sense? So just like Confucianism is a major continuity in Chinese history, serfdom is a major continuity in Russian history. It's not until we get to the modern age that we start seeing serfdom falling apart. And the reason for this wasn't, oh, diplomatic or, oh, the serfs deserve rights. It was more political, okay? The Russians had to look at how it affected them politically. So under Tsar Alexander III, Russia went to war against the Ottoman Empire. Now, both of these empires are gunpowder empires. Russia is a Christian gunpowder empire. The Ottomans are a Muslim gunpowder empire. And why would Russia go to war against the Ottoman Empire? Why would they want this area of the map for their territory? Warm water ports, yet another historical continuity for Russia. Remember that Peter the Great had gone to war against Sweden for the Baltic Sea to get a warm water port. Now they're moving south to the Black Sea to get a warm water port. But it turns out that it wasn't just the Ottoman Turks that Russia ended up fighting. France and Britain jumped into the war. So that's a little confusing. Why would the French and the British get involved in this war? And if they were to get involved in this war, don't they have more in common with Russia than with the Ottomans? Like, what religion was Russia? They were Orthodox, yeah, which is a type of Christian. What religion were the Ottoman Turks? Muslim. What religion were the French? Christian, specifically Catholic. And what religion were the British? Christian, specifically Anglican. Okay, so you have 3 Christian European countries versus 1 Muslim empire. So why would the French and the British side with the Ottomans instead of siding with the Russians? Well, do we fight wars over religion anymore? No, not since 1648, okay, with the 30 Years' War. Now we fight wars over what? Good, TJ. The balance of power. Russia was getting too powerful. Expanding into the Black Sea and gaining this land could make them even more powerful than before. So the French and the British were looking at the expansion of Russia and they were like, okay, maybe we should be worried. We need to take them down a few pegs. So when they hear about this war against the Ottomans Empire used to be incredibly strong. Okay, but look at how close this date is getting to 1913. Okay, close to World War I. This is when we start seeing the very slow but steady decline of the Ottoman Empire. They were known as the sick man of Europe because they were in decline, but they just wouldn't die. They just kept declining. And so everyone was waiting, like, when's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? Okay. And so Russia may have had a chance against the Ottomans if it were just the Ottomans, but against the Ottomans plus the French plus the British, yeah, that was a no-go. So Russia is going to be defeated and they are going to take a devastating L, okay, in this war. Okay, and so they start questioning, why did we lose? What caused us to lose this battle? I thought we had modernized over the past 100 years. We had gotten corruption out of the military. We were training our army. We were building our port cities. What happened to make us lose this major war? And they landed on serfdom as the reason. That serfdom was undermining Russian power. Now, what does serfdom have to do with soldiers? How could serfdom undermine the Russians in this war? 1/3 of the Russian population were serfs. And when you go to war, you need soldiers. So you draft some soldiers. Under feudalism, y'all, the military is not very strong because it's based on, hey, tell your nobles that I need people. And then they have to send those people. Then they have to train those people. Had serfs ever fought before? Maybe in like bar fights, okay? But they were mostly agricultural laborers. So they weren't trained in military strategy. They weren't trained in how to fire a gun or how to even wield a sword, okay? And so the serfs were poorly trained, uneducated, and they had old weapons or they lacked weapons entirely. Like they were told, if the person in front of you falls down and dies, pick up their gun because you don't have one. So they'd send you into battle without a weapon and just be like, okay, go find one, like an Easter egg. That's going to happen again in World War II as well. Okay. And so they were behind militarily. And so they wanted to end serfdom, not because it was a form of coerced labor that was bad for their population, but because it was bad for them politically, that it was holding their country back from becoming modernized, and that it had led to their defeat in the Crimean War. So in 1861, we're going to see the end of serfdom under Alexander II. Okay, now just as a recap, looking at this map, this is all the Ottoman Empire. Okay, Greece is going to declare its independence from the Ottoman Empire and become its own country, but they still hold land in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Europe. Now they conquered Constantinople in 1453. And what did they rename Constantinople? Istanbul. Okay, and then Egypt is also going to essentially declare a basic independence, but they're still nominally under the Ottoman Empire, but we're going to talk about that if we get to period 3. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire became incredibly powerful, but now it's on the decline, and eventually by World War I, it is going to fall apart and become Turkey, which is right next to Hungary. Are we good so far? All right, so if you're looking at our historical thinking skills, causation, what was the catalyst for the end of serfdom? The Crimean War. Now, was that the only factor that led to the end of serfdom? No, you also have Enlightenment ideals. Okay, that eventually spread slowly throughout Russia and especially throughout Europe, and that's going to lead to the call for the end of serfdom. But the Crimean War was the major factor. It was the straw that broke the camel's back that led to the Tsar, Alexander II, to issue the Emancipation of 1861. Okay, emancipation means the freeing up. So serfs become legally free and they gain rights as independent free people, natural rights. This emancipation is going to end serfdom for 23 million people. This is the largest emancipation in world history, but it comes 100 years after Western Europe had already ended serfdom. Okay, so despite all their modernization, Russia was still behind the Western powers. It takes them a full century longer to end serfdom. Because of this, we can note a trend in world history during this time, period 3, away from slave labor and coerced labor. So that is historical significance, y'all. It is historically significant that from the move from period 2 to period 3, we see the rise and fall of slave empires. And then we start seeing a global trend away from slavery and a global trend towards independence, both in the form of countries and in populations. Okay, in Haiti, Saint-Domingue, 1804, we see the independent nation of Haiti emerge and they end slavery. In Jamaica with the Maroon Wars, that's one of the independence movements that ends slavery. In the Western Hemisphere after 1861, Russia had already ended serfdom, and in that same year, the United States enters into its civil war. So by 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation is issued by Abraham Lincoln, okay, eventually ending slavery in the United States. The last country in the Western Hemisphere, in the New World, to end slavery was Brazil in 1888. That is very close, y'all, to the 1900s. Okay, and so we see the end of slavery being endorsed by governments and countries. Does that mean slavery is not in place today? No, slavery still exists throughout the world today, okay, but not as endorsed as a part of a country's government because of this global trend away from that as the Enlightenment spreads. Does that make sense?